All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's 2021 SECCA virtual conference breakout session. Is it accessible? I'm Chad Haney, Marketing Manager 2 here in Strategic Communications at UA. Mute myself coming through YouTube. We ask, speaking of muted, that you keep your microphone muted during this presentation, but please feel free to post questions in the chat. I'll keep up with those while our presenters are going through their presentation, and then we'll hopefully have time to get to your questions at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to my two StratCom colleagues, Kyle Fondren, our Director of Web Strategy, and Ashley Dancy, our Web and UX Accessibility Specialist.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here to talk to you about something that I'm very passionate about, and the entire web communications team is passionate about as well, and that is accessibility. So I'm going to start the presentation now. So what is accessibility? Accessibility is the design and development of websites, web tools, and technology so that people with disabilities can use them. So what we're talking about in that instance is the websites that are made, tools such as video and multimedia, and technology such as screen readers, Zoom text, and other devices that make it easier for someone with disabilities to navigate the web. Accessibility helps users with disabilities. It helps them to understand, and that means perceive and distinguish websites and web tools. It helps them to navigate and interact websites and web tools by the means of using search or using a screen reader, navigating in keyboards and things of that nature. It also helps them aggregate information that they can then use to apply to their knowledge needs, be them students or adults or anyone that needs access to the internet. We want everyone to have access to the internet in an equal way because we all use it every day. And finally, it allows for contribution for people with disabilities. It facilitates participation in and the addition of resources to the web by those with disabilities. So when you have an accessible website and accessible web tools, you are allowing those with disabilities to add to the web, to design websites, to work on different aspects of their ability to create this design and create videos, and it gives them the opportunity that we want for everyone, which is to join us on the web and create things.
All right, so now that we've got sort of a baseline understanding of accessibility and the principles behind it, what's the purpose of everything? So let's talk about where an accessibility effort and compliance with accessibility guidelines and legislation starts in an organization the size of a large university. So institutional compliance, accessibility, and other legal compliance matters with an institution is a very top-down process. It requires leadership that are not only bought in, but they're also bought into the value that comes from committing resources for training. So web accessibility and digital accessibility in general is a very rare skill set. It's very rare to find people who specialize in this. So most of the time, leaders are going to have to commit a lot of resources for training. They're also going to commit a lot of time to learning and understanding the implications on the big picture for their institutions, so that they can also get their colleagues, may that be at the vice presidential level or other levels, to buy in. And this stuff applies to basically all stratas of the university setup. So, and being able to communicate the value to other leaders, and also communicate that value to the people who are going to be sort of the boots on the ground working on these initiatives and working with this set of principles, is a really key effort and key responsibility in your accessibility compliance stack. I think you went back.
Yeah.
One.
Okay, so we all use accessibility. So when we're talking about all, we mean people with disabilities and people without as well. So innovations like autocomplete that we use on creating emails and forms, voice control such as Siri. Think about how lost some of us would be without Siri. I know personally, I truly would be. I ask Siri a lot of questions, as well as voice control on other services. And contrast minimums were initially created for those with disabilities. So contrast minimums help people with low vision, but they also help all of us if we're trying to look at a screen in, say, an area where there's a lot of natural sunlight or bright light. So these are things that we use all the time. As well, in our lifetimes, we will all likely be using accessibility features such as keyboard navigation and website magnification. So one of the important things about accessibility is that you want to be able to make tools usable for people who have different issues. So you're talking about people who are visually impaired, who are hearing impaired, but also people with motor disabilities that make it difficult to use a mouse. So one of the key things that you do in accessibility is make a keyboard navigable without someone having to use a mouse. And as a matter of fact,
I think the slide might be out of order, but I'll take this one. So looking back at it from a leadership perspective, incorporating accessibility principles into your workflows and resource stack is going to help you avoid legal trouble. And really you have to look at it from this perspective. It's way easier to put in accessibility considerations and practices and make that a priority in your institution and in your workflows and in your purchasing process, than deal with lawsuits that can drag out for years and be very costly, federal civil rights investigations, and another point we want to make, the government is watching. If any of you are plugged into some of your web analytics, you might notice from time to time a very large chunk of traffic coming from a couple of suburbs of Washington, D.C. And usually these are federal contractors that are checking out institutions of higher learning and running some of the web spiders that go out and do the baseline accessibility checks.
So you want to be able to follow the law and international guidelines. So the Supreme Court upheld a ruling based upon the Americans with Disabilities Act that requires locations with physical sites to make their websites and other online platforms accessible to those with disabilities. Now, this was a case that was brought against Domino's, and it really changed the way that the people with disabilities were interacting with brick and mortar stores. So a man was saying that he was unable to use the website to order. And Domino's was saying, well, as long as you can call or come to the store, we don't need to change how we're doing things. So he sued, and it moved through the courts, and eventually the Supreme Court ruled, based on the Americans with Disabilities Act, that everyone needs to be able to use a website. So it needs to have standards for people with disabilities. Now, Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act has been amended to use W3C guidelines, which are an international standard. Now, W3C is the World Wide Web Consortium, and they create the standards that we use for web content accessibility guidelines. And at this time, at the University of Alabama, and more than likely at most SEC schools, you are using what's called the WCAG 2.0 AA web standards. These standards are used all over the world, and there are specific laws to other countries as well that allow for the protection of the rights of those with disabilities.
So one thing I want you to think about right now is that right now you do have stakeholders, your members of your key audiences out there, and employees at your institutions that you may have some sway over the, the purchasing process of. You may be buying those tools or resources for students or employees who have disabilities. You know, and all those are people that are really important to the mission of your institutions, and they're using your web resources and your business tools every day. And you really have to think about, if you're approaching this from a leadership standpoint for the first time, are you driving people away? Are you causing them an undue hardship? So those are things that you have to consider with your technology stack as they exist right now. And that applies to your websites as well as those tools that I was talking about that people use to conduct business interactions as an employee or a student. And
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So as far as brand value and accessibility, as leading universities, we must be on the forefront of technology and relevance. Institutions such as ourselves can be examples of accessibility done well and beacons of inclusion. So what we really want as SEC schools is to be on the forefront of creating an accessibility an accessible world, right? We want people to say that our tools, our websites, everything that we are offering is something that is usable for everyone. We want to be able to draw in students who might be on the fence about being able to learn and grow here. We also want to be able to discuss things with people we work with and our stakeholders in the community, and be able to access things that allow them to have the knowledge that they need. So anytime you have say a college of continuing studies or something of that nature, you want to make sure that you have these accessibility features that would assist them. And these common accessibility features, such as the contrast, such as being able to magnify uh, large amounts of, to magnify 400% for people to be able to read if they're not seeing something very well, to be able to use the keyboard for dexterity issues, as well as people who are colorblind, who might not be able to see certain things that you have. So you never want to use color as like your only guidepost on a website. And all of these things will add to our brand value as universities.
So tying into that a little bit, the public image and protecting the reputation of your institution is a really critical part of a job as a communicator in a large institution. And I think it kind of goes without saying that it's a really bad look for a university to be seen as ignorant, callous, or uncaring about individuals who need your resources and services to learn or work. Like it was said before, these institutions are put together to serve everyone, to serve our states, and we have very specific missions when it comes to teaching and being a beacon uh, for our states and our communities. And if you haven't taken accessibility into consideration at all, or you're kind of far behind on it, um, it's not a good look. And accessibility it's a continuous process. There's not really a silver bullet, one and done solution. It becomes a process of decision making, um, because you have to think that all these elements of design, whether how you are coding your websites, how is is your HTML semantic? Does your CSS really work for most browsers and the new accessibility features that are coming out and can come out in the future? Are you planning for those in how your teams develop websites? Um, you know, in each new technology initiative, and we live in an age of technology, um, where it seems like, especially higher ed, we deal with a lot of vendors, we deal with a lot of decision making around purchasing tools for mass use. And each one of these technology initiatives you start has to have accessibility considerations that have to be made right at the very beginning. And especially in the purchasing process, when you are working with you're talking to vendors, sales folks, one of the things that you need to be asking them that's just built into your purchasing process and filling out these tools is, do you have a VPAT? And that if they've got one, that's a really good indicator that they're on the up and up with their accessibility stuff. And most vendors who are up and up on their accessibility chops for their product or their solution, they're going to make a big point on their sales materials. They're going to make a big point of it on their websites that this is a big priority for them. And another key thing to look for in that stack of accessibility stuff with vendors for solutions, how good is their documentation, especially when it comes to accessibility?
So the standards are constantly evolving. So we should be agile in our pursuit of accessibility. So right now we are using WCAG 2.0, AA, but there's also a WCAG 2.1, and there are rumblings of a new one coming down the pipeline. So there's always going to be more guidelines, more things to make sure that things are accessible to people with disabilities. And so we have to be able to evolve and change. We have to be ready to have closed captioning for videos. We have to be ready to have things go through a screen reader and be usable. We have to be prepared to go along with the times. And part of going along with those times is responsive design. Responsive design allows us to have design that goes to different viewports. And it initially became very popular for those with disabilities because they didn't have to use a mouse. And so as we look into responsive design, which most of the websites at the SEC are doing, it really helps us move forward accessibility wise as well.
All right. Again, anyone, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Since we do have a small room, we can, probably okay to unmute yourself. But I'll start off. Kyle and Ashley both. We just went through a new website launch for our ua.edu homepage and those subsites last year. So can you just talk about the differences in designing a new website today as compared to several years ago when accessibility wasn't a huge thought, a huge part of the thought process in web design?
Yeah, so from a leadership perspective, and like one of our first sites, that we had to make accessibility a priority. And as we said through the presentation, accessibility flavors every decision that you make at the inception of a new web project now. And that was especially big for us with the new ua.edu, because we wanted it's launched on an entirely new framework, an entirely new setup, that's completely independent from a system that had been used here at the university for about 6 years when we relaunched. And we wanted to make sure that we started this on the right foot, and it would be something that is on path to be compliant with 2.0 AA, but also looks to the future of 2.1. And those standards are evolving. We don't know exactly, when W3C would flip over and say that 2.1 is the standard. If you're paying attention to some accessibility professional boards, you'll probably have the best pulse on that, and Ashley certainly does. But with our site, it was really a thing that seeped into every decision. Changing the way we do HTML to be semantic, to lend itself to making coding for accessibility be a way easier job for our team. And philosophically here at the university, our unit is looked towards to be the leaders in this. We're building a brand new WordPress theme that's based on WordPress Gutenberg, which in and of itself is a new frontier that's based on the new ua.edu. So we're having to think of all these things at the institutional scale, and this is intended for use for all of our units as sort of a turnkey solution for getting a nice website and UA branding up and running. So we've got to think of all the use cases for campus, and also how that all the accessibility considerations that have to be made there. And also, it's a big part of our quality assurance process with every new block and every new functionality that we make in the new theme. That's sort of a long ramble, but it really does touch every decision you make, especially from a web development angle if you're working on that.
And it's really from the ground up. So from the basis of when we started making the websites, even just deciding, as far as, you know, where video would be, deciding the different symbols and what they could mean, and if they have more of a universal meaning or if they could be something specific to us. So it was research based. I looked at a lot of things to see how other things looked, a lot of things. And you really just want to be able to convey meaning to people in a way that they understand it without any confusion. At times when you have symbols of and things of that nature, it can be difficult if that symbol is not a common symbol for something. But it can also be difficult if you use an icon or symbol that generally means something else to a lot of people. So what I spend a lot of time doing is posting things on forums and asking questions to people that have been doing this much longer than me, and seeing what they say about particular things, because we always want to be in a position where we're helping and not hurting.
Does anybody else have any questions you'd like to ask Kyle or Ashley? If you do, feel free to just unmute yourself. You don't have to put it in the chat.
Yeah, and I'll make one more point off something that Ashley was talking about with the icons, and is this a common symbol? There's one thing that I've found that a lot of people that I've worked with, maybe at a leadership level in this role and other roles, is you tell them, okay, well, we've got to follow this standard by law. And so most of the time that means, very black and white, it either is or it's not. But with accessibility, there's a scale of subjectivity that's, some things are that sort of black and white. It is or it isn't accessible. So like if you're not putting alt text in, inline images that are supposed to convey, a message and part of the content to a user, yeah, that's not accessible. That's a violation. But other things that Ashley can kind of dive in a little bit more on this point is there's a level of subjectivity and sort of a spectrum of, is it accessible enough, that I found that is probably the most difficult part of working with these standards and building products. And Ashley, if you could kind of expand a little bit on the subjectivity nature of it, that'd be awesome.
Certainly. So when we say, is it accessible enough, we're not by any means saying that, oh, we're going to get to a certain point and we're just going to stop because that was good enough. What we're really saying is that since the standards are constantly evolving, and since things can be subjective, you want to make sure that at your basis, you're making something usable for people. So something such as video and closed captioning. Like here we use something called Rev to close caption, and but other websites might use Google, YouTube, or things of that nature. And at times you can get something that's not quite as accurate. And so you have in the disability community where they actually end up calling them craptions because they're not very accurate. But what you really want to be able to do as far as the nuance of something is, if you have a video, how long is that video running? Is that video pertaining to something that would be knowledgeable for your user? So a lot of times we may see on other websites like a background video or something of that nature. And that can be difficult for people with learning disabilities or people with a brain damage issue, because they are feeling a lot of stimulation at that time. So when you have a video, you want to try to make sure that it is something that is informative as opposed to just decorative. And that allows you to follow the guidelines in a way that will be legal as well as helpful. So we want to always be helpful as well as follow the law. It's a two-sided coin, definitely.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on the side of that part, but animation in particular is an area where this part is really at play. There's always a narrow corridor that you can do most things by, but there are some things that are just straight up bad ideas, but others that are less bad that you can get by with if they're done with the appropriate consideration.
Yeah, it generally animation needs to be subtle. A lot of animation can easily set off someone with with epilepsy or other disorders of brain function, and you want to create something that's dynamic, of course, because you're making a website, but scaling it down to the needs of everyone is something that you need to be looking into as well. Uh, Animation can be flashy, and it can be something that you know gives you a real wow factor. It's also something that can very easily be reported to the Office of Civil Rights as something that is deeply bothersome to someone that has a disability. So I think that sometimes people have an issue with not wanting to have something that's too small or too subtle because they want that big bang for their buck on a website. But we also don't want to set off a seizure on someone. We also don't want to have issues for somebody with a vestibular disorder, like someone who is having balance issues. Something like an animation like that can really make them feel ill or disoriented. And people with attention deficit disorder and things like that, if the animation or the videos even aren't starting or stopping, then that can be an issue for them. And that's why when you put a video up, you always put it up with play and stop, because you want to be able to control that video. That's also a WCAG guideline as well.
We probably should have made a slide about this, but some sort of common easy things you can do on a website, particularly since that's our specialty, just quick little tests that you can do that are kind of a barometer of your current level of compliance. One of the things that jumps to my mind is keyboard navigation. So in case you don't know, you're supposed to be able to move about a website with your focus jumping from link to link using the tab key. And if you go on to one of your web properties and just hit tab a bunch of times and see where you jump to, see if there are any places where you get trapped, because that's a violation, and people who aren't able to use a mouse very heavily rely on keyboard controls and the tab function there to get around and use websites. Actually, what are some other of those sort of easy, quick, non-machine based tests that you can do kind of in a quick session on a website?
Definitely the hierarchy of your website, your H1s, your H2s, your paragraphs, or things of that nature. Those don't just help people with disabilities, they also help people without disabilities understand how you're organizing your information. But from a disability standpoint, These go through a screen reader and help them identify what is most important, second most important, and things of that nature. So just the organization of your information is really what can set apart someone being able to use a website. Also, and I know that this is very common amongst devs, but please be sure to set the language of your page. We want people to be able to know what language the web page is going to be in, so that they know that they can understand it, and if not, then they can try to reset it with their screen reader to read to them. And that's one of those ARIA controls, like Kyle was discussing, as far as keyboard navigation. ARIA allows you to focus different things. So.
Have any other questions or comments for Kyle or Ashley? Then feel free to unmute yourself, or if you'd rather put something in the chat. I'll ask Ashley, can you talk about maybe the challenges of going back into an older web property that's been around for, maybe 10 years, and backtracking to make that as accessible as possible?
Yes, so one of the things we have been working on recently is creating a rubric that will allow us to assess a web page or a multi-page site and see what the issues are with it. As times change and evolve, you're going to see that you're going to need different things than you did in the past. And so what you really want to do is utilize your eyes, utilize, if it's video, your ears, looking at closed captioning, but there are also some tools available that are free, such as the Wave tool, as well as the Andy tool that checks code. There are some more robust tools that we use here on campus, but those particular tools allow you to look at a website and see if there are issues with it. Some of the common issues that we see with older websites are the hierarchy, as I said, not quite being understandable, because someone might have used, from a design standpoint, they might have used an H2 heading instead of an H3 just because it looks good, and it looks good visually, but it can be confusing to someone that's using a screen reader, and at times someone who is not. So that can be an issue. Also, if you have not upgraded in a while, the ARIA on a page, the different CSS on a page that would allow it to work, that can give you problems. So really, the first step is to examine it. Nothing replaces your eyes looking at something, but there are tools that can assist you with that as well. And they teach you things, but you also get to understand how certain aspects of a website can be problematic. A lot of times when we run different tools, the first thing that we see is that on images, there's no alternative text. And that might not seem like a big deal, but you have to remember that someone who is visually impaired cannot see the image. So if you're not giving them some sort of description of the image, it might as well not even be on the page. So we want to be inclusive of people who have different abilities at all times. And even with older websites, it takes more work to bring them up to date, but it's worth it because you want people to be able to access information.
Unless anyone else has any other questions or comments for Ashley or Kyle, we'll start to wrap this thing up. We'll give another 2 or 3 seconds, see if anyone unmutes. With that, we thank you all for joining us in this breakout session today. Certainly hope to see everyone on campus here in Tuscaloosa next year as we host SECCA 2022 at the University of Alabama. If you'd like to rewatch this session or watch any of our other breakout sessions, you can do that on our on-demand catalog. These will be available fairly quickly on secca.ua.edu. If you'll go back, we will have closing comments from our interim vice president for strategic communications at UA, Ryan Bradley. So those closing remarks will take place back on the main YouTube stream. And if you close out that window again, you can find that at secca.ua.edu. Ashley and Kyle, thank you both very much for sharing your expertise and your presentation today.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thanks, guys.